After you take the wheel off, remove the cotter pin and nut from the tie rod end. Using a hammer, break loose the tie rod end by tapping the steering knuckle. Next, remove the sway bar linkage. Now remove the 2 remaining brackets and the sway bar will come right out. Now place the jack under the lower control arm. Raise the jack to remove tension from the shock assembly. Remove the shock by unbolting the top and the bottom. You need to place a safety chain between the control arm and the spring. This will keep the spring from coming out and causing harm. Now remove the cotter pins and loosen the nuts on the ball joints about halfway. Do not take the nuts all the way off. Next, take your hammer and tap the brake assembly where the ball joints go through. This will free them up. Before removing the bottom nut, make sure the jack is raised up to relieve tension on it. Next, remove the brake line and cap it off. Now pull off the brake and steering knuckle assembly. Take off the safety chain and pull out the spring. The lower A-arm plates will be marked with a D for driver's side and P for passenger side. Mark the top 2 drill holes with a tab. First, drill a pilot hole. Next, drill out the hole to the proper size. Put the plate back in and tighten the bolts down. Wrap the air fitting in Teflon tape and tighten it to the bag. Now, put the upper front bracket onto the air spring. Install the air spring assembly for mock-up. Mark a line for cutout and remove the air spring. Cut out the metal and grind edges. Make sure they are smooth. Reinstall the air spring. Tighten it down. Jack up the lower A-arm and measure to make sure the bag is in the proper height. Using your hands, check to make sure the bag will not rub. Take the shock and compress it to ride height and tape it to hold it in place. Hold the shock up for a clearance check. You may need to cut into the wheel well. Cut the upper shock mount to size. Tack the upper shock mount into place. Clamp the bottom shock mount into place and measure to make sure the ride height is correct. Make sure the shock does not bottom out when the suspension is fully compressed. Reinstall the hub, wheel, and steering rod to check for clearance. If everything checks out, you can finish the installation. Tap and drill the hole for the bottom shock mount. Bolt it in. Finish welding up the upper shock mount bracket. Clean and paint all the bare metal. Install the airline. Make sure to use a protective sleeve when going through a hole in the metal. Attach the airline to the air spring and install it. Tighten the upper and lower bolts. Now, install the shock and tighten the bolts. Put the tie rod end back into the steering knuckle and tighten the nut down. Replace the cotter pin. Refer to your factory service manual for torque specs. Next, bolt the sway bar back in place, installing the center brackets first. We also opted to put our muscle bars on instead of the factory sway bar. Now put the linkage in and tighten it up. Next, reattach the brake line. Bleed your brakes and grease the ball joints. Finally, reinstall the wheel. Repeat this process for the other side and you're done with the CoolRide installation for the front end.